the painter, Vincent van Gogh. The bare outlines of his life. An appreciated Dutch genius who, in a fit of madness, cut off his ear and later killed himself. Now there's a new biography that challenges a crucial part of the Van Gogh legend.
It was already evening when Vincent returned to the inn, struggling with each step. His walk was unsteady, as if his legs no longer obeyed him. A dark patch of blood spread slowly across his coat. The innkeeper, Gustave Ravu, looked up from behind the counter and called out, "Monsieur Van Gogh, what happened to you?" Vincent met his eyes with a tired expression and, without saying a word, climbed the creaking stairs to his room. When the doctor and innkeeper entered later, they found the artist sitting on the bed, leaning weakly against the wall. His shirt was torn open, and there was a gunshot wound in his chest. He was bleeding out. Van Gogh looked at them and whispered, "Don't blame anyone. I did it myself."
The first inkling I got that there was something wrong was when I really started to look at the existing story. There were so many things about it that were wrong and didn't make sense.
There are countless mysteries surrounding that moment. What secrets were hidden in Van Gogh's final painting? Why did he go to the field to paint as usual, only to shoot himself? Where did he get the gun? Why did the police never recover the weapon? Why didn't he end his life immediately, but instead walk half a mile back to the inn? Which version of the story is true? Who really killed Van Gogh?
He did eat here every day. His only social interaction during the day was in ordering food, which is really incredibly sad. In fact, it seems to have been painted about July 10th, which is more than 2 weeks before he died, and he painted a lot of very happy paintings after that.
On the 30th of March, 1853, in Groot Zundert, a small village in southern Netherlands, the first cry of a newborn echoed through the house of the Protestant pastor Theodorus van Gogh. The baby was named Vincent Willem van Gogh, but the name wasn't chosen at random. It had been meant for another child, the family's firstborn, who was born exactly a year earlier on March 30th, 1852, and died the same day. On a gravestone just a few steps from the house, the name Vincent van Gogh was already engraved. The new Vincent grew up playing in the cemetery where that stone stood. When he learned to read, he saw his own name carved into the cold slab. For the rest of his life, he carried that strange, heavy sense that he was living someone else's existence. The villagers often said, "He plays beside his own grave." The Van Gogh family had 6 children in total. Vincent was the eldest of those who survived. After him came Theo, his lifelong companion, followed by 3 sisters and another brother. Theo was 4 years younger, but their connection was so deep it seemed as if they shared the same soul. When Vincent later wrote his famous letters, most were addressed to Theo, as if he were the only one who truly understood his world. His father, a minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, hoped Vincent would one day follow in his footsteps. The family was strict and deeply religious. Little Vincent grew up listening to sermons every day, and very early he came to feel that life itself was a kind of test. His mother, Anna Cornelia, encouraged his creative side. She painted flowers in watercolor, and young Vincent, watching her brush glide across paper, felt for the first time the quiet magic of creating images. But at that time, it was only a child's curiosity. Vincent was a quiet, thoughtful boy who preferred nature to people. He could spend hours watching the grass sway in the wind or rain slide down the window pane. As a child, he showed no trace of the genius he would later become, only a boy who too soon sensed that his life began in the shadow of another's grave. At 16, Vincent left his home for the first time. The quiet boy with watchful eyes, who once wandered through fields, suddenly found himself in the busy streets of The Hague. His uncle, who owned a well-known art gallery, found him a position as an assistant. The young man, dressed neatly in a dark suit, carried rolled engravings, sent parcels to clients, and learned how to greet wealthy buyers with a polite smile. He loved the paintings, but disliked the people who bought them simply to decorate their walls. In his letters to Theo, he once wrote, "They talk about art as if it were furniture." His time at the gallery became his first journey: London, Paris, The Hague. There he first realized how vast the world truly was. He loved the city life with its misty parks and gray skies. He rented a small room, lived frugally, read the Bible and Dickens, and walked endlessly through the streets, lost in thought. But it was in London where he first experienced heartbreak. Vincent fell in love with his landlady's daughter, Eugenie Lawyer. He proposed to her, but she refused. That rejection cut deeply into his spirit. He became distant and withdrawn. His co-workers noticed the change. The once attentive young man who carefully carried art shipments now stood by the window, staring out blankly, barely responding to conversation. By 1876, he had lost all interest in gallery work. Selling art felt to him like betraying art itself. He resigned, beginning a new phase of wandering and searching. He went to England and Belgium, seeking purpose not in selling paintings, but in serving God. He tried to follow his father's path, working as a teacher and a preacher's assistant. In the poor mining villages of Belgium, where coal dust covered the children's faces, he gave away his own belongings, slept on the floor, and ate what the miners ate. But church authorities soon labeled him as unstable. His passion for helping others seemed excessive, even irrational to them. He was dismissed once again and left with nothing. In 1880, Vincent was 27 years old. He was disillusioned, lost, and nearly broke. He had tried teaching, but it didn't work out. He had also tried preaching, but the church rejected him. Now he was back living with his parents, and the house felt less like a home and more like a prison. Then he met her, Kee Stricker, his cousin, a young widow with a small son. Her face was calm, her gaze gentle, but behind that calmness stood a wall. Vincent fell in love instantly, with the same relentless intensity that would later define his art. He wrote her letters, watched her from afar, and told everyone he wanted to marry her. One day, he finally gathered his courage and proposed. Kee looked him straight in the eye and said 3 words that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. No, never. Never. Most men would have stopped right there, but not Van Gogh. He kept writing to her. He went to her house. He stood at her door until her family forced him to leave. Once, in a desperate gesture, he held his hand over the flame of a candle, saying he wouldn't move it until she came out to him. She never did. To her, he was strange, obsessive, and frightening. To him, she became the first deep rejection that carved into his heart. He wrote to Theo, "I love her, but her no rings inside me like a bell, and I can't find a way to silence it." That no stayed with him. It became a sound that would echo through every disappointment that followed. Yet, during this painful period, something began to shift. Vincent started drawing seriously. It wasn't a grand decision. He simply picked up a pencil and began sketching. Miners' hands, worn-out shoes, and the cracked palms of peasants. His early drawings were clumsy, rough, and heavy, but they carried honesty. He wrote to Theo, "I want to show people as they are, tired, dusty, with earth-stained hands, because there is holiness in that." Theo became his first and greatest supporter. He didn't just send money. He encouraged Vincent through letters, believing that his awkward, troubled brother could grow into a true artist. Around this time, Vincent became deeply focused on simple subjects. He could spend hours sketching a single peasant basket or a clay jug. His style was still far from the colorful strokes that would one day make him famous. These were dark, somber works, painted mostly in browns and grays. In 1885, he completed what he considered his first major work, The Potato Eaters. On a dark canvas, a poor peasant family sat around a table lit by the faint glow of a lamp, their hands coarse, their faces weary. Vincent wanted the viewer to almost smell the boiled potatoes and feel the heaviness of their lives. But the critics didn't understand it. Even Theo told him it was too gloomy. Vincent was hurt, but didn't stop. He had finally discovered what he was meant to do for the rest of his life. The Hague, 1882. Rain drifted through the narrow streets, running down black rooftops, and that same grayness seemed to seep into Vincent's heart. Then he saw her, a woman walking heavily, a cigarette hanging from her lips, a small bundle in her arms that looked like a sleeping child. Her name was Klasina Maria Hornick, but Vincent soon called her by a shorter name, Cienne. She was 3 years older than him. Her face looked tired, her skin pale and worn, her eyes heavy, as if sleepless nights had gathered behind them. Her black hair, always slightly messy, framed a face that had once been beautiful, but now bore the marks of hardship. Cienne was a prostitute. She had been walking the streets of The Hague for years, taking cheap clients to survive. The child in her arms was her daughter, Maria, and she was already pregnant with another. Vincent walked up to her and spoke. No one knows the exact words, but later he wrote to Theo, "I couldn't just walk past her. She stood there alone, soaked, and her eyes told me she expected nothing good from life anymore." He took her to his small rented room, a wooden table, a narrow bed, and the faint smell of paint and charcoal. For Cienne, it was still better than a cold pavement or a shelter. Vincent let her stay. That was how their strange and difficult life together began. Cienne was a woman broken by the streets. Her mother, who was also a prostitute, lived nearby. She often came by to argue or take money. Whenever her mother appeared, Vincent saw Cienne shrink, turning into a frightened child again, apologizing simply for existing. Cienne suffered from illnesses common among women in her line of work, most likely syphilis. At times, fever consumed her, and she could barely get out of bed. Vincent would sit beside her, make her tea, and sketch her as she slept. They shared everything: food, a blanket, and silence. Vincent looked after her daughter, took her to the doctor, and bought her clothes. When Cienne gave birth to her baby, Vincent carried the child as if he were his own. He wrote to Theo, "I want to save her. I want her to feel that she is still a person, not just a thing." He kept drawing her, sitting, smoking, resting, her hands folded on her knees. In each sketch, he wasn't trying to capture her misery, but to find some light within it. Yet, in his world, light and darkness always seemed to live side by side. Cienne never learned how to be grateful. At times, she vanished for several days. At times, she returned to the streets. Sometimes, she came home drunk. Vincent spoke of marrying her, believing he could give her a better life. His family, especially his father, was horrified. Theo wrote to him, "Vincent, you're destroying yourself. You can't live with her. She'll drag you down." But Vincent refused to listen. He believed in mercy. A year went by, and their life turned into a swamp where both slowly sank. Eventually, Cienne left. People said she went back to her old ways, and later died in poverty. Vincent was left alone in an empty room. That story haunted him. It taught him that compassion alone cannot always save someone. He tried to rescue her the same way one might pick up a sick cat from the street. He thought that giving warmth and care would be enough. But people aren't cats. Sometimes a person falls so far that they can't rise again, and then their pain becomes a weight that pulls down the one who tried to help. In 1886, Vincent arrived in Paris to live with Theo. He carried with him canvases painted in browns and blacks, the scent of earth, and a habit of painting, as if the world were made only of labor and sorrow. But Paris was another world, a place of light, new ideas, and modern art. In the small galleries and workshops of Montmartre, he first encountered the Impressionists, Claude Monet, Camille Pissarro, Edgar Degas. They painted as if sunlight itself touched their canvases. The colors were vivid, the brush strokes free, the air alive. Vincent was amazed. His own dark paintings suddenly felt too heavy. He wrote to Theo, "I need to learn to use color like them. Not brown, but blue. Not gray, but lemon yellow." He learned lightness from Monet, courage from Degas, and from the Japanese prince he loved, the simplicity of clean lines. Paris transformed him. He became a new kind of artist. Instead of somber peasants, he now painted streets, cafes, and flowers. Bright blues, rich yellows, and deep greens filled his canvases. Yet while Paris gave him color, it also drained his energy. The loud, restless city wore him down. He grew irritable, uneasy, and restless. By 1888, he knew he couldn't live in that air any longer. He decided to go south, to a place where the sun blazed brighter and colors were pure. He wrote Theo, "I need to go where there is light, real light." That place was Arles. February 1888. The train arrived at the small station in Arles. The southern sun stung his eyes, and even the cold air glowed yellow. Vincent stepped down from the carriage carrying a suitcase, a box of paints, and a dream. He wrote, "Theo, I am searching for light here. Everything must be different. The sun is yellow like a sulfur candle, and it changes everything you see." He rented a small house with green shutters, the yellow house. The walls were worn, the furniture mismatched, but to him it symbolized a new beginning. He painted the shutters, hung his paintings, and prepared the house not just for himself. He dreamed of turning it into a community of artists, a home where painters would live together, work, argue, share paint, wine, and ideas. He kept writing to Theo, "I am waiting for them. I need someone who understands this light, this color." Finally, someone answered. In October 1888, Paul Gauguin arrived. Painter, rebel, sailor, and a man who believed art should be created in wild places, not studios. Vincent welcomed him like a long-awaited older brother. He prepared a room for him and hung his sunflowers there so that Gauguin would see them first thing every morning. The first days were joyful. During the day, they painted, one by the bridge, the other in the fields. In the evenings, they sat in the kitchen of the yellow house, drinking wine and arguing about painting. "You must paint from memory, Vincent, not from nature," Gauguin said, watching him once again set his easel before a sunset. "But I want to paint what I see, and how I see it," Vincent replied. Their arguments were heated but full of energy. Vincent wrote to Theo, "Gauguin brought fire with him. That's what I was missing, but fire turns into flame quickly." Gauguin was sharp, controlling, and used to being obeyed. Vincent was sensitive, impulsive, and his mind was wearing thin. Sometimes their discussions ended in silence, other times in shouting. "Your sunflowers are dirt," Gauguin once said harshly. "And your paintings are lies," Vincent yelled back. Vincent grew increasingly afraid that Gauguin would leave. His dream of a community of artists was falling apart. December 23rd, 1888. The night was cold, the moonlight sharp over Arles. Another argument broke out. No one knows exactly what happened next. What we do know is that Gauguin walked out, and Vincent was left alone. A razor lay on the table. He picked it up and cut off his ear. For years, people debated whether he removed the entire ear or just the lobe. A letter discovered by researcher Bernardet Murphy confirmed that Vincent cut off the whole ear. Blood dripped to the floor. He wrapped it in paper and went to the brothel. He entered, unfolded the paper, and handed it to a woman named Rachel. "Keep this," he said. She screamed. Someone called the police. Vincent was taken to the hospital. They treated his wound, but soon he began hearing voices. He collapsed into blackouts, wrote strange letters, and forgot what he had said moments before. Neighbors petitioned to have the madman with a razor removed from the yellow house. Once again, he was alone. The house that was meant to be a haven for artists became his prison. He still dreamed of a home filled with paintings and friends. It seems he didn't just fear Gauguin's departure, he feared losing his last hope along with him. May 1889. Southern France. The station of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. Vincent stepped off the train carrying a suitcase and his box of paints. No one came to meet him, not family, not friends. Instead, he faced the tall stone walls of the psychiatric clinic, Saint-Paul-de-Moselle. He had asked Theo to send him there. After Arles, after the ear incident, he was losing control. Saint-Rémy was half monastery, half prison. Iron bars, the scent of medicine, long echoing corridors filled with screams and murmurs of those who would never return to sanity. Mornings began with the sound of bells. Sometimes he got up, other times he stayed face down on the pillow until someone knocked on the door. He saw the other patients, women who cried out in their sleep, men who stared blankly at nothing, an old man who tried each morning to catch an invisible bird. But Vincent didn't give in completely to the darkness. He painted. His brushes whispered across the canvas like wind over fields. He painted the garden, the olive trees beyond the wall, and the faces of doctors. And one night, he painted a work the world would later call Starry Night. He looked through the barred window of his room at the sky outside, stars glowing so brightly they seemed alive. They spun and swirled as if moving before his eyes. That night, he picked up his brush. He didn't only paint the sky, he painted what he felt within himself, light struggling against darkness. A crescent moon like an eye, cypress trees stretching toward the heavens like hands reaching for help. That was how Starry Night was born. Later, he wrote to Theo, "I cannot say if there is hope in this painting, but there is movement. Even the night moves." Yet even painting couldn't shield him from the seizures. Sometimes he collapsed, pale and foaming at the mouth. Sometimes he failed to recognize people. Sometimes he begged, "Take my paints away. I'm afraid I'll hurt myself." Doctors gave him morphine, bromide, and sometimes ice baths. He wrote to his brother, "I feel like a man who is drowning but still holds his brush above the water. I know what my treatment costs. I know you are getting tired," Theo reassured him, saying he would never abandon his brother. Still, Vincent felt that his presence was a growing weight on Theo's shoulders. The summer in Overs was bright. Vincent painted endlessly. Under the blazing sun, beneath the rain, in the open fields, and in his room. His brush strokes became faster, more forceful, and his skies more turbulent. His figures seemed to tremble, as if he were already painting the world beyond this one. July 27th, 1890. The morning began like so many before it. Vincent rose early, gathered his paints, and packed a small bag with blank canvases. He looked tired, but focused. The innkeeper saw him leave and thought, "He's heading to the fields again." What happened next remains uncertain, even after more than a century. There are several versions of that day. In one account, Vincent went to a wheat field behind the Château d'Auvers, a place he had painted many times, with its yellow waves of grain, black crows, and a lonely road stretching to nowhere. Many once believed Wheat Field with Crows was his final painting. That evening, he supposedly took a revolver belonging to the innkeeper, pressed it to his chest, and pulled the trigger. The weapon, a small 7mm Le Faucheux revolver, was weak. When he fired, the bullet ricocheted off a rib instead of piercing his heart. It lodged inside his chest, damaging a lung but missing the heart. It was a fatal wound, though not an immediate one. Van Gogh lost consciousness and collapsed in the field. As night fell, he regained awareness and tried to find the revolver to finish what he had started. But it was gone. He pressed his hands against his chest and walked almost half a mile back to the Auberge Ravoux Inn. There, he climbed the stairs to his room. For 2 days, he lay in bed, slowly bleeding, until July 29th, 1890, when he passed away. Dr. Gachet later described the wound. The skin was brown with a violet edge, the violet from bruising, the brown from gunpowder burn. The close range of the shot confirmed that Van Gogh had fired the gun himself. The police accepted it as suicide and did not investigate further. Theo arrived in Auvers in time to spend Vincent's final hours with him. He later wrote, "He held my hand and said he had done it himself. He only asked that we blame no one." In his final letters, Vincent's words carried a haunting sense of farewell. "I feel like a burden to you, to the family, to everyone. I risk my life for my work, and my mind is half ruined." A year before the tragedy, in 1889, Van Gogh had already attempted to take his own life. Different accounts describe it differently. Some say he drank paint and turpentine, while others claim he swallowed paint mixed with kerosene. But all sources agree on one thing: it was an act of deep despair and pain. He was found in time, vomiting, and his life was saved. Later, in a letter to Theo, he confessed, "I no longer know what will happen next." Sometimes it seems to me that death is the only thing that can give me peace. Version 2. In this version, Van Gogh didn't shoot himself. The story unfolds differently, not as a deliberate act, but as a tragic accident. In Auvers, 2 brothers lived, Gaston and René Secretan, wealthy teenagers from Paris who spent their summer holidays there. They were 16 and 18, loud and reckless, and they often mocked the strange painter. René owned a revolver. According to this version, on July 27th, Van Gogh met them in the field. Perhaps they started teasing him again, or maybe they were just fooling around with the gun. The shot, it seems, went off by accident. The bullet struck Vincent from a distance and at an unusual angle, exactly as doctors later reported. When he was found, Van Gogh said only, "Don't blame anyone. I did it myself." Supporters of this theory believe he said that to protect the boys. He knew their lives would be ruined if people discovered they had accidentally killed someone. So he took the blame upon himself. The angle of the wound was indeed strange. and the gun was never found. Van Gogh never owned a weapon. That may explain why he managed to walk back to the inn instead of dying in the field. In this light, his death looks less like self-destruction and more like an act of compassion. He shielded another life, remaining true to who he always was. To his brother, shortly before his death, he said, "This is how I wanted to go." Perhaps he felt relief that his suffering had finally ended, even if by fate's hand. Years later, René Secretan gave an interview before his death in 1957. He admitted that he had a revolver and used it to shoot squirrels. He and his brother Gaston knew Van Gogh well. René claimed the artist had stolen his gun, but he never said a word about the shooting itself. In 1965, a farmer discovered the corroded remains of a revolver in the same field where Van Gogh was believed to have been shot. In June, that gun was sold at a Paris auction for €162,500. If it truly was Van Gogh's weapon, its shallow position in the soil suggested it had been dropped, not hidden. Had Secretan fired the fatal shot, he would likely have concealed the weapon, buried it deep, or thrown it into the nearby Oise River. But if Van Gogh had fired it himself, dropping it where he fell would make sense. The doctors of that era left no detailed diagnosis, but historians widely agree that Van Gogh almost certainly suffered from a venereal disease. He often visited brothels, and in letters to Theo, he hinted at treatments using mercury-based medicine, which was a common remedy then. In the 19th century, such an illness was more than a disease. It was a slow sentence. In its later stages, it caused severe pain in the bones, weakness, and, most devastatingly, damage to the nervous system that led to mental breakdowns and hallucinations. Back then, people never spoke openly about such things. They hid them. At times, Van Gogh suffered seizures, his hands would tremble, and he would faint. His contemporaries believed it was epilepsy, but many modern researchers think these were the effects of his illness. Altogether, it became a long and painful burden he carried alone. Theo arrived the day after the shooting. The brothers spoke little. Vincent was too weak. Yet, when he opened his eyes and looked at Theo, he whispered, "I wanted to bring your son joy, but I can bring only this." Then, with a faint smile, he uttered the last words Theo would never forget. "The sadness will last forever." Moments later, his breathing slowed. Theo held his hand until it went still. At 1:30 in the morning, Vincent van Gogh passed away. On January 25, 1891, just 6 months later, Theo also died at the age of 33. They were buried side by side in the cemetery at Auvers. Among the quiet wheat fields lie 2 graves covered in ivy, resting so close together that even death could not separate them. So, what are your thoughts on this mystery? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe for more content.